All right, all right. Hey, folks, it's Faz here from Faz Lifts. Today, I want to bring to you some new research on the impact of training to failure when volume is equated in trained individuals. So, a really useful and relevant study. Firstly, thanks for making it onto my channel. If you have any comments or discussion about the topic today, that'll be awesome to hear down in the comments. And if you'd like to work with me on your own goals, whether they be strength or physique or fat loss or muscle gain, whatever, there is a link in the description for you to do that. All right, so let's crack on. This was really interesting, and it's a very well put together study, so I'm very excited about it. Basically, the issues with a lot of studies to do with training to failure and not have been that they've not always been on trained individuals, and they've not always had volume equated. So we've kind of looked at it in isolation. This was a really good study. It was a very robust study, and it was released this year. It was reported on Chris Beardsley's Instagram page. So that's the infographic I'm going to show you in a second. And it had two groups, and it compared the groups with the same volumes, training to failure or not trained to failure. And it were testing a whole range of different things. So hypertrophy of the muscles, and also 1 rep max tests, and even vertical jumps. And there was a whole range of different results, which are really interesting. I'm going to primarily focus on hypertrophy today, but I will touch on some of the athletic performance improvements as well, and some interesting wrinkles, which might have some discussion points, which I think are quite cool. So let's begin. I want to show you this. So this is what we've got. So this is what the study was called. It was by Karsten et al., and it was called Impact of two high volume set configuration workouts on resistance training outcomes in recreationally trained men. So essentially what we've got here is muscle growth was almost unanimously better in the training to failure group. So training to failure generally equaled more muscle growth. That was in the quads, that was in the biceps. Also, 1 rep max increased too. Now, I did an interview with a Dr. Steele, who does a lot of research here in the UK with another Dr. James Fisher. And this guy's called Dr. James Steele. Really nice guy. Did an interview with him last year, I think it was, and we discussed training to failure specifically. Now, he's a researcher in the UK, and he does a lot of really robust studies on trained individuals and trained to actual failure. So I know there's been a lot of controversy over Brad's work, and I'm not going to judge it either way, but on some of his 45 set protocols or how close to failure they actually were, James does some research on where he really gets people training to absolute, like Dorian Yates style failure. And when I asked him about training to failure, he said, look, when you're there, you may as well take it. He doesn't believe, and I don't believe either, that the extra few reps are disproportionately more fatiguing than just going to failure. I know that's a popular line that's bandied around a lot by the sort of Renaissance periodization Mike Israel camp, that those extra reps cause a disproportionate amount of fatigue. And I've seen people actually vehemently defend that. I just don't see it in my experience. I don't know, guys. Maybe you want to like talk to me about that in comments. Like, how fatiguing is it just to take a set to failure as opposed to leaving 1 or 2 reps in the tank? Personally, I don't see that much of a difference. I don't know. So there you go. I think that's a little bit overblown. So in any case, getting back to this. So James said to me that, look, if you're that close to failure, you may as well just take it, because the actual growth you get is proportionally more than the reps which are in the first part of the set. And so they're worth going for, even if your fatigue is a little bit higher. But I mean, this is the game we're playing, guys, right? I mean, it's growth. We're after growth. Nothing comes for free. You've got to pay the piper, right? So there's no point avoiding the reps which are going to get you to grow, because they're going to cause you to be tired. I mean, that's what we're at. Yeah, we get tired. You're in the gym. That's what happens. So I don't think they're disproportionately more tiring. If they are disproportionately more tiring than like reps 1 and 2 of a 12 rep set, it's probably because they're more effective. So, well, there you go. They're more tiring. They're more effective. Effective reps tend to be tiring, blah, blah. So my perspective on that is you may as well go to failure. I don't necessarily believe in keeping a couple of reps in the tank as long as it's safe to do so. So like on squats, for example, you might not want to go to failure because it would be dangerous to fail in a squat rack. And very rarely do people actually do that. But in general, if you're doing most machine exercises like chest press machine or lat pull down or even chins and stuff like that, you may as well go to failure. I don't believe it's worth the trade-off. Yes, those reps are fatiguing, but they're also effective. Now, here was another interesting thing. So there was one area where the not to failure group actually got better results, and that was the anterior deltoid. I thought this was particularly interesting because the not trained to failure crew tend not to do a great deal of anterior delt work. Have you noticed? So again, going to the whole Renaissance periodization, Mike Israetel type of like, don't go to failure. They also don't do a lot of overhead presses. They do mostly side laterals and rear. I found that quite an interesting, side tangent there. And I wonder if there's something in that. Maybe if you're trained to failure, perhaps it's a different story. Those groups who were trained to failure seem to get a different result with the anterior delts. Those who weren't trained to failure seem to do better. Who knows? I found that quite interesting. So what this seems to point to is a couple of things. One, failure, when volume is equated, definitely causes more growth, mostly overall, perhaps in the exception of anterior delts, but that might simply be because they ended up doing more reps altogether. Now, if we have a look, here we go. Chris actually commented on this. He said, the group that stopped 5 reps before failure significantly increased the size of only one of the measured muscles, the anterior delt, which was trained with the largest number of sets as it was trained with more exercises. So this may be the case. If you are doing a relatively high volume routine, you may not need to, because the anterior delt just gets so much overlap volume anyway. It gets exponentially more than other muscle groups because there's overlap between the chest work, between the shoulder work and everything else, even to the bicep work to a certain extent. So it does appear to point to two things. One, that failure equals more growth. And two, that volume also equals more growth. Now, the way that I like to sort of look at this is from the perspective of stimulus. Okay, let's get away from the whole like weird fitness bodybuilding law crowd for a second. Okay, let's just look at what we are. We are adaptive organisms. Okay, that's what we do. That's literally why we've survived for as long as we have. So if there is more of a stimulus, we are going to adapt more. Ergo, more volume, more intensity will cause a stronger adaptation stimulus, which will cause us to adapt more. Just look at it from that perspective. And forget everything you've learned the last sort of 50, 60 years. Just look at it from the perspective of biology. All right, let's take it right back to Hans Selye and the general adaptation syndrome. The more you do, the stronger the stimulus is. And as long as you can recover from it, the greater the adaptation is going to be. So think of it that way. The volume and the intensity are both stimuli which are going to cause you to adapt. Now, the interesting kind of wrinkle there is we also have a certain level of anabolic resistance which builds up over time. And that's going to cause us to need more of an adaptive stimulus, so more volume, more frequency. So let's take a look at like what affects this. So that when you're a rank beginner, you can do pretty much whatever you like and gain. Okay, there's very little resistance there. You can just train, you gain, train, you gain, and you can train with a very minimal amount, and you can still gain. Okay, this is why it's not really an achievement to get a beginner to an intermediate status. Like it's going to happen if they just put in some work anyway and be consistent. To get somebody from intermediate to advanced, that's a different story altogether. So think of how, in terms of like whether you need volume, higher volumes or higher intensities, think of it like this. It depends on your level of anabolic resistance. Now, the anabolic resistance can increase over time due to training advancement. So the more advanced you are, the more volume and intensity you're going to need. Okay. In general, there are some other disease states which make you need more as well. So like obesity is a known one. The fatter you are, probably the more work you'll need than an equivalent leaner person, or you when you're leaner. Now that's just, it's a truth of the matter. It's also one of the reasons why I don't believe in keeping my guys and girls at a higher body fat. The whole P ratio argument, if you guys have heard of that, let me know if you've got in the comments if you have. If not, I'll do a video on it. The whole P ratio argument, I like to keep my guys and girls on the leaner side during the course of the year, to lean to the point where they're comfortable, comfortable level of leanness, because I believe that they'll grow the best that way. And that's what I've experienced. So obesity provides a certain level of anabolic resistance. A training age, so a level of advancement provides a certain level of anabolic resistance, and to a certain extent, age will as well, but probably not as much as you might think. Like if you're sat there and you're 30 years old and thinking, oh, it wasn't like that back in the heyday when I was 20, like, come on, get a grip. Like you're still young. Even at 40, even at my age, like it's not the end of the world. I'm thinking more like when you're like 60, 70, 80 years old, then there's a certain level of anabolic resistance. And the only thing is you're going to need more work to exert the same stimulus. And that's really when training becomes, it gets to a point where you're going to hit a plateau when you're a lot older, is that the level of stimulus that you'll need to actually advance might compromise how much you can recover from, and that's when you're going to have cause problems. But then at that stage, you're probably going to be mostly maintaining anyway. Or if you get into it later in life, you've still got room to grow because you're still a relative beginner, so your anabolic resistance is less. So I guess the way that I want to summarize this is the easiest way to think about this, guys, is that frequent intensity and volume are both dials you can turn up, and you don't need to necessarily turn them up the closer you are to being a beginner and being lean and being young. All right, so if you are a young beginner who's very lean, naturally very skinny, you probably don't need that much stimulus in the gym to grow. It's probably more about what you do in the kitchen. Now, if you are an older let's take me for example. Let's say you're close to being 40. By end of this week, guys, members, wish me happy birthday. So let's say you're close to being 40 and you're also relatively advanced, and so, that's going to raise your level of anabolic resistance. So you're going to need more work. So there's a reason why I do far more sets per week than many of you guys, or what I would recommend to my clients, because it's individualized for me. I'm older, I have a higher level of advancement. Now, let's say I was, 30% body fat, I'd need even more. So all those factors affect how much you should tune up those dials of volume and intensity. Think of it that way, rather than you get the situation in the bodybuilding law now where you're either in the intensity camp or you're in the volume camp. The whole Mike Mentzer thing is like intensity. And then it's like Arnie's like volume. So rather than going in camps, think of them more like dials you can tune up depending on your level of advancement and what you need. And just they are factors you can play around with. Like if you need to get more results, you can tune them up a little bit. And this study really confirms a lot of that. And that's always been my thoughts on the subject. That's how I explain volume and intensity to people. Drive them up depending on what you need. All right, folks, I am going to call it there. Let me know if you have any comments about this. I personally love this kind of stuff. I think it's really fascinating. So I'd love to talk more about it in the comments. So hopefully that was interesting for you guys, and I will speak to you all soon.